I really enjoy doing puzzles and playing games with my family. Unfortunately, we don't really have a good spot to do it where we can leave the game set up for an extended period of time. Sometimes when we're doing a puzzle, it takes us quite a few days to complete it. And during that time, it can get knocked around, have things set on top of it, or the dog takes a piece for himself. We really just need a table that's better suited for playing games and doing puzzles. So here's what I came up with. It looks like an ordinary coffee table, but when assembling a puzzle, there's a drawer on either side that can hold your pieces, and you can preserve your work in an internal box underneath the removable surface boards. Additionally, there's 4 more of those surface boards that comprise the lower shelf, and each one of them can be flipped over and used as a gaming tray that can be inserted into one of the 4 mortises on either side of the table. Each one has notches to hold Scrabble tiles or dominoes, some saw curves to hold playing cards, and some pockets to hold game tokens and to collect the fallen tears of my opponents. Alright, let's see if I can make this thing happen. As you might have guessed, I decided to make this project out of walnut. So I started by bringing in a bunch of rough sawn boards that I've had drying in the garage for years. The first step was to roughly mark out where they needed to be broken down and to chop them up using the miter saw. Then each one got shimmed up on a sled and passed through the planer to get one flat surface. Once I had one side flat, I could ditch the sled, flip the piece over, and start work on the other side. Now I did this for all the boards until I had them all down to their desired thickness. With 2 flat sides, I could put a clean square edge on each piece over at the joiner. Then, referencing those clean edges, I cut out each piece to their final widths over at the table saw. And then I broke down a sheet of plywood as well. I rough cut some thick walnut using a bandsaw and then planed them down to be perfect 2-inch square legs. Now you're probably wondering why I'm making 5 legs instead of just 4. Well, the answer's easy. It's because I like to be odd. Then over at the miter station, I could cut down all the pieces to their final lengths. And eventually, all the pieces were ready. Several pieces needed rabbets cut in, so I loaded up my dado stack in the table saw and I put on my sacrificial fence to get the job done. The first part of the table to assemble is the internal box. I start by gluing up the walnut edge pieces onto each of the sides. And once that was done, I could move on to putting together the box itself. And for that, I just used real basic construction. Butt joints, a little bit of glue, and a few brads to hold it in place. This box won't see any real weight, so this is more than strong enough for what it's going to be used for. And since all the joints will be hidden for this box, I'll be telling everybody that I used hand-cut dovetails and they'll just have to take my word for it. With 1/2-inch plywood not really being a 1/2 inch, there was a tiny little overhang that needed to be zipped off with the flush trim bit. Next, the 2 drawer boxes could be put together in much the same way. With the dado stack still in the table saw, I could cut some notches into the top edges of the table apron pieces. Now these will form the mortises for the gaming trays in a later step. I just used my magnetic featherboard as a stop block to get them cut to the perfect size. and I also clamped on a sacrificial backer board to prevent any tear out. Then I loaded up this mean looking router bit so that I could make some floating tenons. This thing is used in conjunction with the Beadlock jig from Rockler. You simply take some 3/8" stock and you run it through on both sides, and it creates a piece that looks like the Olympics logo that someone stepped on. Now the Beadlock system is a way to create loose tenon joinery, and it's made up of just two pieces. You have the jig itself, which is ruggedly made from aluminum and steel, and then you have the drill bit and collar. The way it works is pretty easy. You first just find the center of your stock, and then adjust the jig so that the drill holes line up with it. Then you mark where you want the edge of the mortise to be, and you clamp the jig into position with it. I set the depth collar on the bit, and I proceeded to drill out the first 3 holes in the jig. Then I loosen the drill guide, nudge it over, and drill out the first 2 holes. Once I knock out all the sawdust, I'm left with 5 overlapping holes that perfectly match the tenon stock that I cut before. It's a pretty clever system, and it seems to work great. So I went ahead and I drilled out all the mortises and cut all the tenons for the legs, the apron pieces, and the lower shelf frame. Now, since the pieces that make up the bottom shelf extend past the inside of the legs, I have to miter those ends. To do that quickly and easily, I just used my miter sled at the table saw, and I nipped off those corners. Then, in an effort to reduce a painful sanding session later, I decided to sand as much as I could prior to assembling the table frame. And once I got things nice and smooth, I went ahead and I started to glue in the tenons into each of the legs. Once those were in, I began to put together each of the sides of the frame. I just gave it some taparoos with a mallet and then squeezed it nice and tight in the clamps to make sure all the gaps were closed up. With both of the long sides being together, I could then attach the short ends. And then put the entire frame together. Now the outer edge of the table surface is a typical frame. I used my miter sled to put some 45s on the ends and then glued up the frame using a band clamp, making sure that the corners are nice and crisp. At this point, I could use some clamps to make a temporary shelf so that I could drop the internal box inside of the frame and get it into position. Then I used some digital calipers because it makes me look smart on camera. And then I cut some spacers out on the table saw that I used to glue in and secure the box in place. I needed to make some dowels for the next step, so I set up my dowel making jig and I quickly made 2 different sizes. Using a Forstner bit and a regular drill bit, I made a hole right on the edge of the internal box that the dowel could fit into. Next, I needed to drill a center hole within the larger dowel. I took care of that over at the drill press by lowering the piece down onto the drill bit. I just drilled into some scrap wood, flipped the bit upside down, and put it down into the hole. And then I put the dowel piece into the chuck. Gluing the pieces together, and now I can drop it into position and flush trim off the top. If I knew how to saw. Now I can mount the drawer slides. I just find center and line up the mounting holes with the mark and screw them into place. And to do the slides, I just used a jig to make it easy. And then I put my drawers on, and I put my drawers on. To mount the faces, I used some playing cards as spacers to evenly center things before I added clamps to lock it into place. Then, as you'd suspect, I drilled a mounting hole from the inside, countersunk, and drove in some flathead screws to fasten it on. At this point, I could glue down the tabletop frame. I ran a bead of glue around the top of the legs, the apron, and the top edge of the internal box. Then, with the surgical precision of a rhino, I clamped the heck out of it. Rockler has a ton of router bits, one of which is this cool dish carving bit that I thought would be perfect to cut out some trays to hold some game pieces. I made some jigs out of scrap wood that I could clamp down on top of each of the surface boards. Then, using my trim router, I could trace the inside area and remove all the material for each section. I started in the center and then slowly worked my way out until I could run the base of the router against the four walls of the jig. And the jig was reversible too, so that I could do both ends of each of the gaming trays. And then to do the center, I made a second jig that would fit over the top and had a larger area for me to cut out with the router. This part was kind of fun, but boy was it messy. I had walnut shavings in places of my body that I didn't even know existed. Next, I took each of the gaming trays over to the table saw to cut out notches for dominoes. I just set the blade to a 45 and then ran them through in both directions. When that was done, I changed blades to a thin curved blade and adjusted the angle to 70 degrees. These cuts will be used to hold playing cards for various games. 4 of the boards got just one of these cuts, but then in the other 4, I added more to accommodate a larger variety of games. I figured it would be a good idea to soften the exposed edge of the tenons, so I put in a 1/2-inch roundover bit and I dragged each one of them across it on the router table. Then I modified one of the router jigs by gluing on some guide blocks, and I used it to help me glue the tenons onto each one of the gaming trays very consistently. Now it occurred to me if I finish a puzzle using the internal box of the table, that I wouldn't be able to remove it without accidentally destroying it. So with that in mind, I came up with the idea of making a removable bottom out of a thin sheet of masonite. I cut out some strips of leather from my neighbor's car seats, and then I used a contact cement to glue them into tiny handles for each side. Then with a permanent marker, I darkened the edges, and they were done. Easy as that. A little bit of Danish oil darkened up the color of the board, and then I dropped it in the table to see how it fit. Perfect. I gave everything a thorough sanding, and then I put my mark on the bottom of the inside box. Next, it was time for finish. For that, I chose to spray on 3 coats of a water-based polyurethane. This ought to give it plenty of protection for years to come. Between coats, I sanded with 220 to keep it perfectly smooth, and then I followed that up with another coat of poly. And here's the finished product. I just love how it turned out. The figure of the walnut surface boards is amazing, and it adds so much character to the piece. I really like the contrast of the different grain styles that run down the sides, too. The little hidden piston is a fun surprise to show people, and their mind is blown when you show them how each of the surface boards can be flipped over and used as a gaming tray. And the multiple styles of trays really makes this table equipped to play a whole variety of games. We've been having a blast using it to work on puzzles. Since everything is encapsulated within the table, you can spend days working on a puzzle without risking it getting damaged or losing a piece. And when you finish the puzzle, you can easily lift it out and slide it off onto another surface to glue it up and frame if you wanted to. And whether we're playing dominoes or cards or board games, the gaming trays have been wonderful for giving us plenty of additional space as well as a nice way to keep all the pieces organized. Well, that's it. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you feel I've earned it, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to try building this table for yourself, I'll have very detailed step-by-step plans available over at my website at fishersshoponline.com. Also, a big thanks goes out to Rockler for sponsoring the video. If you'd like more information about the Rockler products used in this project, I'll have links to each one in the video description. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Oh crap, that didn't go in. Oh, that is a double crap. Oh, just drop it on the floor. Whoa. That that was smoky. Is it not even in the chuck? I never tightened the chuck. Oh, idiot. Oh my gosh. Crap. Oh crap. I drilled this in the wrong spot. Oh. Ooh, but it'll be on the inside, so nobody will have to know. Alright. But still, bummer.